What is up, guys? The Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be something very different for the album ranking segment. And I was told actually by one of my subscribers that he suggested that I should do videos on ranking albums through Tiermaker. And that really got me thinking. And I was thinking to myself of which band I have not covered yet, of ranking a band's discography on there. So I'm going to be doing the Tiermaker album ranking for one of my favorite bands of all time, which is Deftones. Now, Deftones are one of those bands that have not made any bad album. They are one of my favorite bands for a lot of reasons. I love the variety and just the whole quality of the music, with so much differences in sound and production. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go into each album from the first to the latest and see where I am going to be ranking these albums. So just because that there is an album that you love that I would rank lower doesn't mean that I don't like it, or the opposite way round, of an album you don't like with an album that I like I would rank higher. This is all on my personal opinion, so if you want to share your list in the comment section below, please feel free to do so. So anyways, let's jump right into this. The first album being Adrenaline. Now, I'm going to put this album in the C tier. Now, the reason why I put this album in the C tier is because that I personally don't think that it's like one of their best albums, and I'm not one of those people that accepts the production very much. I know that Ross Robinson was involved with Deftones doing work with them, and this is not one of those albums that sounded top-notch already for a debut album, but it does have some of my favorite Deftones tracks, like Bored, to my personal favorite 7 Words, to Engine Number 9. There were some of the riffs that sounded really good and intriguing, especially hearing Abe Cunningham's drumming for the first time. Chino's vocals were really growing more and more over time. But personally, I don't think this is one of those albums that really works as like a really strong debut album. Despite the production and the weak mixing, in my honest opinion, this is a very solid album. But there are other metal debut albums like Slipknot to Mastodon, Black Sabbath, and Iron Maiden. Metal albums like those, they are more favourable. But I think some of the instrumentation-wise on here can be a little bit forgettable and not as well crafted. That's personally all I would like to very much say on this album. So Adrenaline goes into C tier, but a very respectable album ranking position. The next album I'm going to put in Around the Fur as an A. Now, the album is always one of my favorites from the band, and needless to say, it sounds heavier. There is some more of that new metal aesthetics. The production is absolutely brilliant on here. This is the beginning where we hear Deftones at one of their best production albums. Music-wise, it's much more memorable and distinctive. Love the tracks of My Own Summer, To Be Quiet and Drive Far Away, and some of the other tracks they're very underrated. Chino's vocals were really aggressive, especially onto his screams, and I find some more of the versatility on the album to have more quality as the album progresses, and this just sounds really good. Absolutely one of my favorite albums from the band, and there isn't really much I could personally talk about this as much, though there are some fans that would pick Around the Fur as their favorite. I can understand why, because some of the music on the album sounded aggressive, even more catchier, and it really marks something very big for the Deftones later on in their sound. But needless to say, Around the Fur is a massive improvement over what Adrenaline was. I did like Adrenaline, but personally, for the connection, I think Around the Fur is the first album that I could pick as one of those second albums I put in above the debut album from any major band. So Around the Fur goes onto the A mark. Now we go to White Pony, and this is obviously an S tier. This album is always one of my favourite albums of all time, and this just has Terry Date's very best production. I've talked about it with a collaborative review with EQP TV. For those that have not seen the review yet, please check it out. But this album is their magnum opus. It sounds modern, and it still sounds as fresh today. I adore a lot of the stuff onto the record. The heaviness, the moodiness, and the atmospheric sounds from tracks like Digital Bath to Knife Party, Change in the House of Flies, to Korea, Street Cop, Pink Maggot. This album, every track from start to finish, has a separate identity, passionate and dedicated stuff here. And this is where we hear some more of these samples for the first time in the sound of Deftones, and this is absolutely and always will be my favourite album from Deftones entirely. So if you haven't seen my review, like I said, definitely check it out, as me and Elliot go in depth with what our views are, why we love the album very much. But White Pony always stands out as one of the essential albums in modern metal, and this was voted number 2 for me as my second favourite from the 2000s for metal albums. That's just how much I adore this album. White Pony, no questions asked, always in the S tier. Now, this is going to get controversial for some people for the self-titled album. Again, I'm going to have to put that in C. Now, I don't dislike this album just because I put this album at C. The reason why I put it at this part, it is because I don't think it follows up White Pony in a massive way. Yet to learn that there is some more of the alternative, the atmosphere shoegazy kind of sound that Deftones would later on incorporate in their sound. But there are some really good tracks, Hexagram, and one of my top favourite Deftones tracks of all time, which is Minerva. But I just don't think that the album's material follows each other very, very well. Chino's vocals on here sounded more expressive and completely melodic. That's what I really like, possibly the most on this album, besides the diversity that this album really takes into more custody, and especially with some wonderful production. I can see why that some people would not really regard this as one of their best. It's pretty underrated, but actually I do find another album to be very underrated that I will talk about next. The self-titled album, for me, still sounds very, very good, but it's not one of those albums that I would play very, very often in this case and scenario. So just don't expect for me to really regard this as a strong album, because White Pony is obviously their best, and there's no other album that could beat that album. But the self-titled Deftones album is still one of those that I absolutely accept as a follow-up to White Pony. Well, not enough to really give a massive amount of acclaim like the previous album. So that's why the self-titled album is at the C mark. The next album is Saturday Night Wrist, and this is going to get controversial for some fans. I'm going to put this in the B ranking. So I personally find Saturday Night Wrist to maybe be their most underrated. And I know that there is some more of that softness and the alternative side of metal sounds than the the abrasive, heavier sounds of their previous material, but I really like Saturday Night Wrist. I was actually discovering the Deftones through this album's era. I love some of the tracks on here, Hole in the Earth to Mine, which is one of my top 5 Deftones songs of all time. But I personally like more of the underrated tracks. There were a few that I'm a little on the fence about, which doesn't follow up massively like the earlier albums do. But Saturday Night Wrist, in terms of more of the clean tones, the atmospheres, the effects, and the adventurous direction that this band decides to go into, I really like this album. So Saturday Night Wrist is one of those albums where they sound very matured, and that's what I personally like a lot with some of the later sound from Deftones entirely. Not to mention that I do love the heaviness surrounded their sound on the very few earlier albums go, but with albums like this where they just go totally different, this is where I really start to accept and appreciate the overall shifts and progression where Deftones would later on go into with later albums. Saturday Night Wrist is very, very good, and I really do like this album a lot. The next album, Diamond Eyes, again, I'm going to put this album in the B position. So Diamond Eyes is where they return back into their heavier roots. Some of the riff orientations are very genty and less, I would say, diverse. But I think that there is a lot of that hook that this album does deliver into their sound. The title track to Rocket Skates, which I love that song. You've seen The Butcher. Once again, this is just some brilliant production done as well, like Saturday Night Wrist. There are some really, really good tracks. The musicianship is one of the best parts about this album. Differences in comparisons to the tonality of the band earlier and later on, but I think Diamond Eyes would mark, to me, at one of Deftones' best in musicianship, like White Pony, for example, as well. Diamond Eyes is, to me, one of those very, very good, diverse records in their discography, and I do like the melodic arrangements as well from Chino, and as well as Stephen's more effectively simple driven riffs, but still adds in a lot of the awesome heavy distorted crunch. So Diamond Eyes, to me, stays into the B mark. Now we go into Koi no Yokan, and I'm going to put this in A. I absolutely have been loving this album more and more as the discography went on. I gave it, a lot of positivity when the album came out, when I started doing album reviews. But to me, this is their best album in the 2010s. This sound is really out there, and I love more of the tracks to the record, Swerve City, and to Tempest, and What's Happened to You. Some more of these tracks with so much beauty. There's a lot of these beautiful, colourful, out there, shoegazy, wonderful effects from the guitars. And to really find this album at, in my opinion, one of Deftones' very best overall in their discography, this is, to me, easily one of their strongest album in that decade. And I would absolutely maybe position this as like one of the best albums of the 2010s, as well as with the next two albums go. This album always stands out to me as just one of their very best albums. Now we go into Gore, and this is going to piss some fans off, but I don't think this is a very good album. It's not terrible, but actually, I'll have to put it in C again. And the worst part about this album is, to me, the production. It sounds like awful shit. And I know Stephen was not happy during the making of this album. There isn't a lot of these positives that I could personally express with this album. There are some really good stuff on the record, musically and performance-wise, but to me this is the weakest Deftones album that I would put in Adrenaline above Gore by itself. Now this album is definitely a record where it has its moments, and I was looking forward to listen to the record in anticipation, but this is one of those albums that sounded, not really that memorable, and not really one of those albums that works out as a complete listening experience. So I do find that there are some hidden gems on the record, and I quite liked the changes with the guitar riffs to the vocals, and also with some more of these soundscapes, but I just don't think this is one of those albums that would work out for me as one of the best albums in their discography, and hence that's why I've just said that it's their weakest album. So yeah, Gore, my least favourite in the Deftones discography, but it's still, to me, very much an above average album. Now we go into the latest album in their discography, Ohms, and I'm going to have to put this in A, and I have placed this as my favourite album of 2020, and I know some people say that it's overhyped, but for me, being a fan of this band for ages, this was my most played Deftones album ever since it was released, and I still find this production to really have an alike style, like with White Pony and Koino Yokon. This album just adds so much flavors that really works for me every time I play this album. I love a lot of the tracks on here, to Genesis, Error, some of their other incredible songs on here. This is just, to me, Deftones at their very best since their earlier stuff. Personally, I have given it that much acclaim that I would maybe put this in as one of the best albums of the decade already. And I know that can be overboarding to hear, but ever since that I was loving this band with their discography entirely. To me, Ohms is an absolute near perfect made album, and if you want to see my full review of this album, I highly recommend that you should watch my collab review of this album with Jamie Horsley. Shout out to him, and we go in depth why we really got to talk about this album in our detailed ways. But Ohms just stays in as the A pick for this tier list. But with all of that being said, White Pony is one of my favorite albums of all time, and always works as the only top classic S tier Deftones album. So there you go, guys. That is my Tiermaker album discography ranking for Deftones' discography. Please share your ranking in the comment section below, and tell me what your thoughts are on my list, and share your comments with your rankings of Deftones' albums wherever you place these albums in this type of ranking. So I am really glad to do this type of direction for an album ranking. I would still like to do the discography ranking from my least favorite to my favorite still, because that's what I actually prefer. However, with something different like this is maybe something that I would like to do for any random band's discography entirely for another different band. So that's all I would like to say for this album ranking on Deftones' discography with the Tiermaker website. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.